I would say that's a fair assessment of our Harry. He don't have much confidence. But he do listen to what's in here. Hagrid smiled lovingly at the absent Harry as he placed his hand over his huge, tank-top-covered chest. Very much like his parents in that respect. Lily was like that. Her confidence was off. And James, well, he would listen to his heart, even when it were telling him to do something that was breaking the rules. Cecilia took the tea he was proffering silently. Alone in his hut, just with the ticking of the clock, and Hagrid's slow breathing, she felt calmer. The outside influences of noise, lessons, children, Dobby, green flames in grates and so on which caused her so often to delay her train of thought, entirely absent. "Do you want to tell me? Perhaps I can help." Cecilia sipped at her tea, stopping in mid-swallow before deciding it was too rude to spit it back out. He caught the look on her face. "No. Well, I am probably not the right person to talk to. You're thinking," he said, sitting back down. "But you know you can always talk to me." Cecilia swallowed the rest of the tea and smiled. "Do you think I could return here this week? When I've finished classes? I mean, would you mind? It's just so peaceful here. I know I'll be able to get it when I have a chance to concentrate." "Of course, Mrs. Frobisher, come any time you like. I told you that before." "The links I have so far," she pressed, determined to let Hagrid know that wasn't what she was thinking, that spells in the wizard world depend on energy. "You have energy that make the spells happen. Professor Snape and I have done a lot of work on that already and come up with patterns and relationships for different types of spells. And there seems to be a connection with blood, like you said before, between different families. Well," she continued, putting her cup and saucer down and stroking Fang, who had somehow mysteriously appeared by her, "I managed to test it out scientifically." Hagrid stared at her, and nodded towards Fang. "I think he's impressed," he said, pouring himself another cup of tea. "I'm doing toasted crumpets for breakfast," he added, gesturing to the packet half open on the table. "There's not much mold on them that won't scrape off. So, what did you find out scientifically?" he added, prompting her to continue. "That the links to different types of blood, as wizards call them, pure blood, half-blood, mole-born, squib, and so on, all match the inheritance patterns moles expect in families too. And so I tested them, and the pattern linked." Cecilia shuffled in her chair, and swallowed. "But now there are complications. The work that Harry and Ron are doing for me will be useful because it links the scientists in the Mole world to the information that Madame Pomfrey showed me with Pompops and his work in hospital. But what links science to magic?" She looked at Hagrid, expecting him to have switched off, having allowed her to continue for her own sake. "Have you thought that there is no link? Perhaps wizards and moles are truly different?" "No," said Cecilia determinedly. "I cannot believe that, not from the evidence we have. There is a genetic link we have shown in science through wizards which is backed up by your own stories and folklore about families. Spells have patterns, especially the non-healthy terminal patterns on moles. I'm just missing something, and I wonder whether it is something fundamental, which is hidden and requires searching for, or peripheral which I just haven't found yet. And the work Harry and Ron are doing is about the life of a wizard who has a strong connection to science." Raymond Lully. She noticed Hagrid's features fix when she mentioned the name. "What?" she said, catching his eye. "Do you know him, Hagrid?" Well," said Hagrid, looking from right to left and placing down the knife he was using to demold the crumpets. "Only in passing, like. I remember Binns speak of him during Harry's history lesson once when I was learning to be a teacher myself. I remembered the name 'cause it sounded foreign. And Binns said he died in the same year as the Goblin riots. 1956. In 1956, yes, he said, looking at her quickly. And I said to myself, I remember them riots, and I remember the name of Raymond Lully. I flew down to London, to Diagonal E. I was young at the time, and it was a time when I'd left school, but had no job. 'Cause I was big, I thought it would be a laugh, and I wouldn't get hurt. And we heard the goblins from the bank had closed the doors. They were in the street protesting about being slaves to wizards, and this man by the name of Voldemort was going to free 'em, so they wouldn't be slaves no more. Hagrid picked up his tea again and sipped. Cecilia noticed his hand was shaking. Course we didn't recognize the name then. It was just a strange sounding name said by these goblins. People from the ministry came in to see 'em, and when they couldn't reason with 'em, the goblins turned on the shops in Diagon E, smashing windows, looting all sorts, even attacking some of the wizards inside. It was chaos, and the ministry were not prepared for it. Oh, they tried, of course, but they couldn't get the goblins to listen, and some of them were killed. I was standing next to one of them. By the time I'd regretted ever going down, and one of the goblins killed a wizard using Avada Kedavra. He shuddered and Cecilia smiled reassuringly, waiting for him to continue. That was at a time when they were just spells. They weren't outlawed as they are today. The spell just missed me and got the other fellow. I turned, and I heard one goblin say to the other one that the man they had killed wasn't Raymond Lully after all. The other one told him that it wouldn't matter, he would be got by the end of the day. And I remember, clear as day, thinking two things, Mrs. Frobisher. First, that if I'd been standing just 2 feet to my left, I would have been the wizard they had mistaken from Raymond Lully. And second, why when the goblins were rioting against their enslavery, were they looking for this wizard to kill him? Cecilia looked at Hagrid carefully. The huge man now seemed to have shrunk to almost half his height as he recalled this terrifying incident in his past. He'd paled and began to look nervous, such was the impact of the events he was describing, on his life when they'd occurred. She got to her feet slowly and crossed the floor to where he was standing, hands pressed flat against the table with white knuckles through the pressure of supporting his body. Carefully she rubbed what bit of his arm she could reach. Hagrid looked down at her. "Don't mind me," he said, looking down at her, "nothing for you to worry about. All I were trying to say was it was odd that Binns mentioned Raymond Lully had died in that year, and referred to the goblin riots when goblins in those riots were looking to kill him." Yes, thought Cecilia. Strange indeed. And stranger still, Hagrid, when a Raymond Lully seemed to be present with some famous mole scientists when big discoveries were going on. He looked down at her, and frowned. "So he's in your world too," he mused, "and wrapped up in this. Well, in that case, Mrs. Frobisher, I think that the work you're doing is important, 'cause that amount of coincidence is just too much. And I reckon I was wrong to think that they're not related. So," he said, standing full height again and filling his hut, "why don't you collect your work this morning and come back down here? I'll see to it that you're not disturbed." 88,888,888. "And what's your project going to be on, Neville?" Cecilia smiled with her mouth to her 4th class that week. It was Thursday and she had decided on Monday, when she hadn't prepared anything substantial to teach, to give her students a choice of a project. Initially she was going to choose the project for them, but when the second year's obsession, which had clearly been developing out of sight for the past couple of months, namely football, Cecilia relented and allowed her students free choice. Her only criteria was that the project must include both the mole and wizard point of view, but other than that she allowed the lessons to be freer than usual, with students either visiting the library or remaining in the classroom, collecting information. Said Neville, "I thought," he began, looking quickly at Ron. "Haven't you decided?" Cecilia prompted, trying not to sound as if she was rushing him, and trying to not to think about her research. "I have," said Neville, "but I wasn't sure if it would be okay. Neville wants to research you, Mrs. Frobisher, laughed Hermione. Neville shot her a look, then looked down, turning red. I'm sure you mean a squib at Hogwarts, clarified Cecilia quickly. She looked at Neville, who nodded. Right, said Cecilia, as the 3:30 chime rung out from the clocked hour. Now you've chosen your projects, you've the rest of the lesson, and until the end of term to complete them. Are there any questions? She looked around at the fifth formers as they looked at one another, eager, or not so eager looking at Seamus Finnegan, to get on with it. Yes, Hermione? Is there a word count? Ron and Harry looked at her, before looking at one another. No, said Cecilia, but it must be at least 2,000 words. Yes, Parvati. Can we use primary evidence? Quotes. As long as it's subjective, like you said? Cecilia nodded. And without further ado, the class broke up informally and began to work, sitting back to read through their preliminary work, collecting books from the generic Mole Studies collection or discussing with their friends what they intended to include. Inspired, thought Cecilia as she watched them, sitting at the front of the class, updating her mock book with information that she had neglected for almost 3 weeks. Why hadn't she thought of this before? Soon, the half-hour of her last lesson that week passed swiftly and, with 1 or 2 final questions on the way out, as the last student departed, Cecilia put her feet on the desk, and closed her eyes. Thank heaven she had nothing to do tomorrow, except for attend the Quidditch final. There were no lessons in the morning, and she intended to visit Hagrid to work quietly. And she jumped a mile when she heard Harry say to Ron, "Shall we come back later?" "Oh," Cecilia said, waking up with a start. "Harry. What can I do for you?" "Well, we just wanted to ask, the work we're doing for you, does that count towards our project?" Cecilia got to her feet and stretched her legs, realizing it was dark, and the fire in the grate had dimmed. Yes," she replied uncertainly. "I thought I'd said that." "Yes," said Harry, "but we were just checking. We've done some of it," he added, winking conspiratorially. Cecilia looked at him, not following what he was saying. Then she realized Hermione was waiting impatiently outside. "Oh," she said, smiling. "Yes. Oh, there was something I was meaning to ask you, Harry," she added, as both young wizards turned to leave. "Why did you miss Wednesday?" He looked at her in surprise. "Well, you said you were busy, Mrs. Frobisher, don't you remember?" Harry looked back at her in earnest, looking back at Ron for confirmation. "You did. We saw you as you left the classroom. About 8 o'clock. Cecilia frowned. What was going on? She had neglected to visit Hagrid that evening, and had waited for Harry all evening. It wasn't as if she'd left either. She smiled again at them and nodded. "Okay, well perhaps you could come on Saturday. Lunchtime? I'd like to see how far you've got with your project," she finished quickly, realizing Hermione had pushed open the door to usher them out of the classroom quickly. "What was that all about?" said Hermione as Harry and Ron hurried to catch up with her as she paced quickly down the hall towards the library. "I thought you were doing scientists." "We are," said Harry, looking at Ron. "We were just asking for an extension, you know, because of the Quidditch final tomorrow. And making sure she was coming," he added. "An extension? For 1 day? I don't know why you're worrying her when she's that tired she forgot she told you she'd cancel your lesson on Wednesday. Next you'll be telling me you asked her to the Quidditch match tomorrow, too," she added, looking between 2 guilty faces. "Well, she enjoyed it last time," said Ron, defensively as Hermione stopped in the act of turning the handle of the library door. She rolled her eyes. "Honestly," she said chidingly and left Harry and Ron to look at each other with the unspoken question hanging between them as she stalked away. 88,888,888 Cecilia had made a decision when she had woken up on Friday morning. She dressed quickly and knocked on Snape's door before dawn. He had been surprised and consequently annoyed, but she had told him simply that they needed to go through the work together for her to make headway. She had felt nervous at her own firmness, but happy that she had stuck to the decision she had come to the previous night. And surprisingly, Snape had agreed to meet her in the Mole Studies classroom that afternoon to discuss it, stating pointedly that it was more important than a Quidditch match. Cecilia had nodded and returned to the classroom, thanking herself for not mentioning Harry and Ron's involvement, as she had almost done, as she didn't want it to be an excuse for him not to appear today. "And if he doesn't come," she said, sitting with her legs up on her desk and continuing to scribble something down, "then I'll have to appeal to Dumbledore or I'll never get anywhere." It seemed that her assertive start to the day was beginning to pay off. When the door opened and closed 5 hours later, Cecilia was so engrossed in her work that she didn't notice Dobby appear before her. "Lady didn't come for breakfast or lunch," he said in painful tones, as if Cecilia had offended him personally by not putting in an appearance. "Dobby is worried about Lady." She looked up as the house elf, wearing dungarees and a polo neck jumper, placed a plate of sandwiches before her and tugged with all his might at the paper she had in her hand. "Dobby!" she exclaimed when he'd finally wrestled it from her. Then she saw his face, and patted the bench next to her where she sat in front of the fire, inviting Dobby to join her. When he didn't respond, she held out a sandwich, and automatically he was sitting next to her. Getting better, thought Cecilia as he tucked into one half of the sandwich. He used to be far more subservient, but I suppose he meant it when he declared me, as a mole, to be as low as himself. "There," she said, before taking a bite of the cheese and pickle sandwich he had made for her. "It's delicious," she added, chewing it carefully. "Dobby has to take care of Lady," said Dobby, as if instructing a child. "One day, Lady may not have anyone to look after her." And a few hours later, Snape finally arrived, entering the Mole Studies classroom quietly at about 3 o'clock before closing it firmly. Without arguing or mentioning his long-running absence, he asked Cecilia to run through the results and the premise she had already formulated, nodding or shaking his head as she went, questioning parts where she was unclear and adding his own spin. Cecilia showed him the DNA traces, pointing out what they were and which sample matched which wizard, before showing him the distinctive W band as he held up to the weak winter light. "Okay, go back to the original hypothesis. What do our results show us?" He paced around the trace before overlaying the next. "I've mapped the similarities and differences in the contributors," said Cecilia, looking at the key she had drawn, and where the bands are equally similar and different. "My conclusion suggests that the environment decides the degree of wizardness in a mole born, however And you believe this because of Petunia Dursley's sample?" he interrupted, picking up that DNA trace and looking at it again. She moved across and pointed out the significant part. "If she were to be in a magic environment, as Hermione is, then it is likely her magic powers would develop or become more apparent." "Then I cannot see what the problem is. You have the evidence now that matches your premise and hypotheses, Cecilia, about inheritance and the blood samples we tested. There is nothing more to be said." He stepped away from her before glancing at the papers on the desk. "I expect it was good to be home," he added, glancing up at her. Cecilia nodded. "You met Nick. It was good to see him." "Then I believe the work is proceeding well. It'll soon be time for me to integrate it into a successful potion for Potter," he continued, looking through the rest of the traces, and Cecilia felt a pang of relief at her presence of mind to remove those of Sirius and Draco. The DNA had confirmed Mendelian traits in wizards, Severus, and has shown a vital piece of information about mole-born wizards. Have you ever come across such a phenomenon before? Perhaps in other mole-borns? The look he gave her made her stop in her quickness of thought. "Not offhand," he said, continuing to look at the traces. However, I will investigate. Now, what else are you struggling with? Show me, he commanded, and Cecilia took a seat, leafing through her notes and describing what she had managed to do. And Severus Snape stopped all day and worked with Cecilia Frobisher, doing all that she imagined. Where she became entangled in her thinking, he talked her through. When he jumped in with science that wasn't quite valid, she gently reminded him. Like the old times, Cecilia thought, and was delighted with their progress and tried not to think how much further on they would be if he had helped like he'd promised. "What about rechecking the blood samples now we've confirmed it?" said Snape. "We don't have any of Petunia Dursley's blood," said Cecilia, looking at him. "And the samples we do have will have degraded by now, so unless you are suggesting we get new ones then dash." "What can we do about the endocrine system?" said Snape, unabashed. "If it is to do with hormones, how can we test that?" "It's to do with energy. A function within the body can't be tested in a lab like that. We could if I was back at home, but it'd be to do with blood, I'm afraid." Stuck again. She flopped the sheaf of notes onto the desk. "Leave it with me," said Snape, slowly. "I'm not promising anything, but if I can get a small sample of Petunia Dursley's blood, and you'll have to persuade Potter for some more of his own. I believe she attends a clinic where she allows some to be removed for the purposes of others." "Oh," said Cecilia, as she realized what he meant. "She's a blood donor." He nodded in agreement. "However, you must get Potter to promise that he will not tell anyone that he has given blood to you, for reasons of confidentiality," Snape added, looking at her firmly. Cecilia nodded. And with that, Snape arranged to meet her tomorrow evening to continue their work before leaving her to carry on with it. Cecilia sat back and looked at the work. Even though she had got little further than that morning, now Snape had gone over it all with her, she felt much more secure. Like their foundations were firmer upon which they were building. Yet it was still so frustrating not being close to a full picture yet. She still awaited the work from Harry. There was nothing of an Oswald T. and the connection between Lully, the Goblin riots and 1956 from Hagrid, while sound did not take her anywhere. And how was that word reciprocate a link to all of this? Cecilia decided that what she needed after all of this was a chance to reflect. The connection was there, and now Snape was helping her. It would be sooner discovered. And perhaps the warm water would soothe her addled mind. An hour later she stepped out of the bathroom, her hair wrapped in a towel and wearing warm, terry pajamas. Sitting down on her bed cross-legged, she began to pat her hair dry and considered the second assertive decision she had made that day. Whether or not Harry and Ron had finished the work by tomorrow night, she would retrieve all the documents back from them and spend time going through them herself. Then she would be able to spot things that they may have overlooked and also put her mind at rest that that branch of research had been thoroughly explored. Getting to her feet, Cecilia crossed to her dressing table and picked up her hairbrush, ready to tease out the knots in her hair that seemed to be the result of the mineralized tap water that was used in the castle. "My, don't you look beautiful?" she heard behind her, turning to see who had come in without knocking, and preparing to take them off. "The towel round your hair looks so fetching, and the way you screw up your eyes rather than put on your glasses, well, that's truly a step on in cosmetic enhancement." "Sirius." Cecilia frowned in his direction, and his green, flickering head in the fireplace dodged out of the way as she threw her hairbrush at him into the grate. "I thought I'd told you not to do that. I could have been naked. I would have let you know before it got that far, well, possibly anyway," he added cheekily. "I've waited all day for you to come back to your room." Cecilia gave him another stare, and folded her arms. "Please leave. I'm far too busy to deal with intruders like you, Black." She continued to stare at his image in the flames. "I bet Snivellus has great fun trying to keep that feistiness of yours under control," Sirius grinned as Cecilia stood there, growing angrier by the second. Fine, she said, if you're not going to leave, I will. Cecilia grabbed her dressing gown and slippers and began to make for the door. Look, said Sirius, a tone of seriousness in his voice. You seem to be spending an awful lot of time working and I'm worried about your health. You missed your appointment with Harry on Wednesday, he added. Cecilia stopped her walk towards the door and turned to look at him and raised a finger as if to say something, but became lost for words. I asked Harry because we hadn't heard from you. He didn't want to tell me. I must say, you've conjured up quite a loyalty in him. Sirius, I'm going behind my wardrobe to change, she said finally. But please don't go. It has been such a long time since I spoke to you, and I apologize for my abruptness before. Tell me how you are, she continued, opening up her wardrobe door and selecting jeans and a jumper before stepping behind the open door to change. Fine, here. We've been having order meetings nearly 3 times a week now. Oh? Said Cecilia, leaning from behind the door. No one's mentioned that to me. I don't think it's anything of consequence, really, replied Sirius, hoping she couldn't detect the lie in his mind. Just the same old peacekeeping. Cecilia emerged far more conservatively dressed than she had done a few moments ago and sat in front of the fire on the flagstones, looking at Sirius. You'll have to pick up the brush you threw at me to neaten that lovely long hair of yours, Cecilia, he said as she smiled at him. Then you'll be fine. Carefully she leaned into the hearth and rescued it from the back. Sorry, she said, as she reached through Sirius's shoulder. You can't feel that, can you? No, and neither should you have been able to, said Sirius, looking at her questioningly. Cecilia shook her head. I didn't, she said, taking the brush in her hand. Shame I can't change this like Tunks can, she said, brushing through her unruly locks. How great that would be, not to be Ginger anymore. Nothing wrong with that. The Weasley family are more than evidence there. You were saying boy at the same old peacekeeping, said Cecilia. So why are there so many more meetings? That I haven't heard about, she added to herself. Dumbledore realizes you're busy. From what he said tonight he thinks you're doing well to keep pursuing all that you are towards this. It must be a tough job. I know I couldn't do it. Well, it's important. I'm sure someone will tell me. She looked at Sirius, who said nothing. Sirius, she said urgently, ceasing her hair brushing for a moment to look at him. If it's important, please tell me. Sirius looked at her pointedly before continuing. I think you ought to know, Cecilia. No one has said, not to any of us at least. But I think the big attack that Dumbledore is anticipating is going to come much sooner than expected. I believe the reason no one has said anything to you, and the reason Snape has been keeping out of the way is because the work needs to be done quickly, much more quickly. Cecilia stopped, thinking about what Sirius had just told her. So really, I'm not wearing myself out for nothing then, she said, almost to herself. It's needed yesterday, and every day I delay is a day that's going to bring us all into danger. You can't think of it like that, Cecilia. You can only do it in the time you can. Especially if Snivellus is not pulling his weight, he added acidly. I never said that, said Cecilia. You know he has work for the Order. So he's not assisting. Well, it's no wonder you're exhausted. I can see you're exhausted, he interrupted as Cecilia was about to wave away lightly her increasing exhaustion. And he hasn't killed you? She stared at him. So you're not here to talk to me, just to dig up information to use against him? Cecilia got to her feet, annoyed. No, said Sirius quickly. Look, Cecilia, I've known him for a long time, I know what he's like. As do I, Cecilia thought to herself. Why does it always have to be about Severus? It isn't. You've been working far too hard at this and I am concerned with your health. Without him, you can't keep up this rate. Have you ever asked him why he chooses to leave you on your own? He is a Death Eater after all, and betrayal is in his nature. But you were the one who told me he was on our side. Besides, I trust him. Severus wouldn't betray me, and besides, he was a Death Eater. He may still have the mark, but inside he is a member of the Order. Such allegiance is implicit, as you said before. Are you quite sure, Cecilia? Only you know how you work together. You could return to Grimwald Place if it means that the Order could help you. Cecilia shook her head. I need to be here. This is our work. He will not understand. She retook her cross-legged position on the flagstones. However, Cecilia looked at the floor. What? She gazed back at Sirius, his face flickering before her. Nothing, Sirius, Cecilia replied, thinking of the mark on his arm and what he had told her so personally about his life before Hogwarts. And remembering who was asking her. It just seemed odd that when it came to it, he didn't want me to leave, even though it would advance our work. I was going home, to the town where I lived, and for some reason he thought it was dangerous. Why? The question was rhetorical, and Sirius did not reply. If you like, you can talk to me. I can help you when Snape is otherwise detained. That's very good of you, Cecilia said, looking back at Sirius and smiling. I am mostly stuck on linking the genetics to wizard inheritance. I think it has something to do with the endocrine system response, but Actually, I am probably not the best person to ask, seeing as I didn't understand many of the words you just said. He grinned. Well, I'm sure you're good for something, said Cecilia, laughing. Sirius stopped grinning. Yes, like saving your life. I think I'd like to save your life again sometime. Sometime soon. Good night. Night, Sirius, said Cecilia, getting to her feet. She threw her arms down by her side before bouncing onto the bed. How come Sirius Black knew just exactly how to get under her skin? 88,888,888. So, what would she need to check the hormone levels in people, she wondered, as she studied one of her A-level biology textbooks again. It was Saturday afternoon, and Cecilia had once again spent most of the day with the door to the classroom shut and her work around her, thinking through it. The tests described here would be complicated. If she could see what they had in common, she could see if there was a related piece of information she could use from the blood samples. Carefully, she noted down the main biological process of homeostasis, and proceeded to read through the notes that Nick had given to her. Biology, she sighed, half an hour later. It was far more complicated than atoms and physics. They obeyed logical rules that could be calculated mathematically. Even biology came down to maths if you could repeat the tests for long enough or with sufficient accuracy. But it was the ever-variable nature of the subject that irritated her. At least when atoms decompose, they had the decency to do so with regularity, so a half-life could be plotted on with compounds, so products could be determined. With biology, you never knew. I suppose that was why to some scientists it was interesting. And also an ethical minefield. Mrs. Frobisher, said Harry, entering the classroom without knocking. Cecilia looked up from her book and stopped. Hello, Harry. You're a bit early for the lesson, but that's okay. We can start now. She closed the book, but before Cecilia could say or do anything else, Harry began to speak. We know about genetics, he said hurriedly. Me and Ron. We've done all of the notes, Mrs. Frobisher, and we know all of the scientists that discovered DNA, and where they exist in the cells. Everything. What? Well, there's little bits of information, called genes in your cells, said Ron excitedly. And in 1953 two mole scientists called Crick and Watson showed what the chemicals looked like. Like a spirally curled ladder. And that's inside your cells that tells you who you are. Cecilia got to her feet and looked at the pile of papers Harry was holding out. No, I mean, what did you say? Did you say you'd done all of them? They nodded. Cecilia leaned against the table. And we got the information we needed about the scientists for our project, so we don't have to do any more work for it, except for write it, which we'll do now and save us time, said Ron, with uncharacteristic keenness for academia. Will we? Said Harry, uncertainly. Well, if we could work here, Mrs. Frobisher, then perhaps you could help us if we're stuck. And we're sorry you were too busy to make the Quidditch match. Cecilia looked up at their keen faces, feeling somewhat guilty for breaking her promise. Who won? Ravenclaw, said Harry, but it was a close-run thing. It was more important to beat Slytherin last week, though. Against Ravenclaw, at least we can bear it, Ron said pragmatically. Can we? Far better to have the trophy. So, let's have a look at this work then. Did you find all who were on the list? Harry nodded, pointing down the first sheet. Here, they had listed the names of the mole scientists, the dates and nature of their work where they were associated with the name Raymond Lully. Cecilia looked down the list. The first thing she noticed was how disparate the list was. The scientists were from all disciplines: genetics, atomic physics, psychology. It went on. Rutherford, Mendel, Crick, and Watson, Pavlov, Skinner, de Broglie, Boer. She looked up at both Harry and Ron, shaking her head. I can't actually believe it, said Cecilia, finally. You both have worked so hard on this. It's exactly what I needed. She looked down at the page again. Crowfoot, Röntgen, Hahn, Boltzmann, what? 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 Repeated Cecilia. Yes, what? Said Ron again, smirking to Harry. Oh yes, very funny, said Cecilia, getting the joke. Like, what is the unit for power? What is the unit for power? Asked Harry. What is the unit for power? Said Ron, laughing. He nudged Harry, and waited for him to laugh too. Oh come on, Harry, he said. What? Oh, listen here, Ron said, irritably, digging out the encyclopedia that Cecilia had given to him. James Watt, born 1736. British instrument maker and engineer. Inventor of the modern steam engine. So? How is that to do with power? Ron glared at him for a moment before returning to the encyclopedia, glancing over the top as he turned the page. The unit of power, the watt, was named after him. The unit for energy per second. I wonder if there were any Weasley scientists, Ron wondered aloud, turning over a couple of pages. Professor Weasley, inventor of the dot of there. He put the book on the bench before Cecilia, so both he and Harry could look. No, said Ron, disappointment in his voice. Harry glanced up at Cecilia. What about Frobisher? Cecilia smiled. Ah yes, said Ron, picking the book up dramatically. A Professor Frobisher, recently elected scientific professor at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the theory of Merlin wizard science. Ron looked knowingly between Harry and Cecilia and raised his eyebrows. Ably assisted by Professor Potter, researcher and test subject. They all laughed. So, is it all right if we stay? By all means, said Cecilia, collecting the notes they had efficiently prepared for her and glancing through them. And again, many thanks for all of this, it has been a huge help. I'll see to it that you gain a few house points for this, she added, as the boys took seats a few benches down and opened up their encyclopedias. Let me see if there are any Potters, she heard Harry say as she read through a couple of pages. There really were a few scientists here. She would have to double-check the context, of course, and each reference, but in real terms the two young wizards who had been so keen to help her had saved her probably 4 days' work. Cecilia looked back at the A-level book and began to read through the part about the endocrine system again, and had divided her page into two. On one side she began to list hormones that were to do with disease and defense, and the other was for the names of the chemicals that were for homeostasis, in short to keep levels in balance, such as insulin and glycogen for sugar levels. Just as she had completed the first half and had written down the word adrenaline, Cecilia heard Harry's voice. "But you never know," he said to Ron. "That man Lully was a wizard. Why not Joseph Black?" Cecilia put down her pen in surprise. "Don't be stupid. Don't you think we would have heard about it if he was? I mean, he's your godfather, after all." Cecilia blinked when she realized both Harry and Ron were staring at her. "What do you think, Mrs. Frobisher?" said Ron, quickly. "I looked up what again, and we found out he was taught by a Joseph Black. Harry thinks he's related to Sirius." Cecilia stopped what she was doing, her notebook falling from her hand. "No, I don't," said Harry, nudging Ron. "I just said might. I know it's a coincidence. I'm not that thick," he added, looking down. "What did Joseph Black do, Ron?" asked Cecilia slowly, swallowing once or twice. "Well, he was a Scottish engineer, born in 1728. And he discovered a gas which was fixed, and he told James Watt about it when he was his teacher, and helped him with his design of the steam engine. Watt sent him designs in the post." "Oh," said Cecilia, looking back at the notes Harry and Ron had left for her. "No mention of Joseph Black. Well, you never know, Harry. He might be related to Sirius. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I've spent far too much time working, and by the look of all this, so have you. Whatever you have now for your project, you can give to me, and we can say that you're done for mole studies this term." "Thanks, Mrs. Frobisher," said Ron and Harry in unison, handing over their parchments. "See you," they said, racing off. When she was sure both of the wizards had departed, she locked the mole studies classroom door behind her and departed to Hagrid's hut. On opening the door to a shaking Cecilia with books in hands, he ushered her inside. Having established she was not hurt in any way, returned to heating up water to make a liniment for Fang as Cecilia sat in a chair by the open fire and read through the 3 pages of notes they had made for her, every so often wiping a tear from her eye. 88,888,888. That Voldemort used old magic to attack the mole citizens of this country was entirely unprecedented, repeated Dumbledore. The Order of the Phoenix were gathered in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place once more. "We can only deal with what has happened and minimize the possibility of other attacks until we can safely overcome them. Gentlemen. Wizards." Mrs. Weasley had turned from serving the sandwiches to shout at the increasing disorder that was occurring before her. "Not entirely, for I believe Mrs. Frobisher is close to completing her work. Is that not correct, Professor?" Sirius looked at Dumbledore, while throwing a scathing look at Snape. "What interest do you have in moles, Black, apart from the obvious?" The room began to grow suddenly quieter as Sirius took a step towards Snape. "And here we are yet again," said Sirius, addressing the Order, "at a meeting where Severus Snape has nothing to show for his effort. It is progressing, Black, which is more than I can say about anything else about the plan. Except that the Dark Lord has begun to move quicker than Professor Dumbledore anticipated. And do you know the reason for that, Snape? You should, seeing as you are in Voldemort's confidence." The room was now deathly silent as all of the Order members watched the argument play out before them. Just then, Dumbledore cleared his throat. "Sirius, until Mrs. Frobisher completes the connection, Severus cannot begin on the potion. This is plain. And she is working to her full capacity in order to complete this." Dumbledore looked at the rest of the Order, glancing at each one in turn. "And to solve the mystery of the old magic that killed so many moles on Halloween, I have the best. I must thank you, Sirius, for providing the literature." Dumbledore looked around at the Order again. Benjamin Wurgs, Alastair Moody and Professor McGonagall are all contributing to unraveling the potency of the curse that was performed so it can never happen again. Miss Tonks, do you have a final number on those killed? Tonks looked quickly at Mr. Weasley before stepping forward. Last count, it was 876. That includes all those identified. But as we know, there are more which couldn't be identified. She nodded as she finished to the order as whispers began to grow. That many? We did all we could at the time. How was it we didn't know? Was there any pattern to the killings? Doris Crockwood stepped forward now, and addressed Tonks. She looked nervously at Mr. Weasley again. Who put her out of her misery? No, said Arthur, rubbing his chin with his pen that he was using to take minutes of the meeting. Not that we can ascertain anyway. But we are looking into it. This time, Snape looked at Dumbledore, signaling he had a relevant comment to make. Severus? Said Dumbledore. The room went silent again. More attacks are planned using the old magic. The Dark Lord plans to attack more prevalently and more high-profile. Against Muggles he despises the most. Those that provide a future for Muggles, in his eyes. Businesses, doctors, politicians, teachers. He paused as he caught Sirius's eye. Black looked as if he was about to burst with rage. Any teachers in particular? Sirius interrupted with a glint in his eye. Any important Muggles of your acquaintance, Snape? Is she safe in your hands? She is safe, despite Voldemort's knowledge of her. Which is uncanny. For no one in this order would surely jeopardize this vital work. Without thinking, Dumbledore stepped between the two wizards. Gentlemen, this is not appropriate to the matter in hand. If you cannot restrict your information and questions, Sirius, Severus, he looked sternly at each wizard in turn, to our business, I will close this meeting. Both wizards flicked each other a withering glance before looking away. Excuse me, said Remus, stepping forward from the back. He stood next to Tonks. Yes, Remus. Do you have an appropriate comment to make? I believe we should tell Cecilia, he said. When she has finished the work, that is. It's not fair for her to be part of this order and not be told the information, whether or not it is connected with her work. No, said Mrs. Weasley quickly. She doesn't need to know this. She doesn't, Remus. It's devastating. Dreadful. And she is working her hardest for us. Perhaps we should consider it. The voice came from Reginald Ellis Mumford, who had opposed Cecilia joining the order in the summer. She has proved her worth, Dumbledore. I second Remus. Cecilia Frobisher is due to finish her work soon. I will ask her to present her findings to us. At that meeting, before she joins us, I will ask you all whether you think she should be aware of it. I have given you time to consider the implications of this for, as she is a member of the Order of the Phoenix, a Muggle she remains. The decision is weighty and therefore deserves careful consideration. Now, unless there is any more business, Dumbledore looked round to catch any last-minute contributors. I call this meeting to a close. What are you playing at? Said Tonks, as the wizards began to intermingle in the kitchen and living room. She can't know that, it'd be dreadful. Remus looked up and saw Sirius approaching them. What do you think, Sirius? Asked Tonks. Isn't Remus just a little bit out of his mind? I think that there are more than enough things to think about here than that, said Sirius to them quietly. Snape knows something which has changed things. Night, Molly, he added loudly, as Molly and Arthur walked past them. When they were gone, Sirius lowered his voice again. Dumbledore's unsure of all of this and keeps putting his trust in Snivellus. And he's supposed to be helping Cecilia, right? So why isn't he? He looked between Remus and Tonks, sinking into a kitchen chair. Remus sat too. If I were he, I would be by her side, supporting her if I had nothing to hide, agreed Tonks. But we know Snape's got plenty to hide, which is why he's left her to cope on her own. What do you think, Remus? About Snape and Cecilia. Sirius just said he'd be by her side supporting her. And if I was there, I wouldn't leave her alone, said Remus. Tonks looked at him in astonishment. Look, he said hurriedly. She's been through so much. I don't think she should be left alone, even if she is doing the research. Then things like Draco breaking into her room and Slytherin tormenting her day after day wouldn't be a problem. Tonks sat down between Sirius and Remus. And you want her to know about the mole killings with all that on her plate? She asked, incredulously. Honestly, Remus. She smiled at him, before leaving the kitchen. Well, I'm still not convinced, said Sirius, waving his wand and producing a pot of tea. The tea poured of its own accord into 2 cups that had appeared with it. There's something that not even Dumbledore is pleased with. She hasn't come to any conclusions yet, and if Voldemort uses the old magic again before Snape's made that potion for Harry, we'll all be in trouble. He said Voldemort knew of her. She's in so much danger, Sirius, still being at Hogwarts. Then it's as I said, Moony, she'll be better off when she finishes the work and goes back to her own world. Remus nodded in agreement. We must trust that Cecilia is close, then, replied Remus, taking a cup, and feeling the cuts and bruises of his recent visit to the Forbidden Forest with Sirius. If we have lost our room to maneuver as Tonks thinks we have, her work's going to go from important to crucial for us all. 88,888,888. It made sense. Those words were far from adequate for it, really. But finally, after 8 hours of sitting in silence, reading everything Harry and Ron had prepared for her, it fell into place, like a well-oiled cog. After 8 hours, and 5 weeks, and 3 months. All these deadlines from the time it actually started. But it was done, and now, Cecilia could barely believe it. Hagrid, she said, looking up. She could not control the flow of tears as the realization that she had finally completed the work overwhelmed her. Mrs. Frobisher, I must say, if I'd have known that you would be getting yourself in a state over all of this, I might have had to have words with Dumbledore myself. He patted her on the back until the sobs died down. I know how important this all is for ye. And for all of us too. There. Don't fret now. When Cecilia had finally regained composure, she asked Hagrid if she could explain it to him. He nodded, and sat back in his chair, nodding as she spoke. You won't understand, said Cecilia, quickly. Don't matter, he said. I'd like to hear this miraculous work you've done, Mrs. Frobisher, in any case. She nodded, and looked down at her notes. Lully, she said, nodding to Hagrid, who sat further up in his chair at the name. He spent time with mole scientists. Scientists who eventually made the greatest contributions to science this century. With every one of them, a Raymond Lully was involved. With the physicists, Röntgen, Bohr, Rutherford, Hahn, it's energy. Atomic theory. Energy levels, electrons. Electrons release energy, you see, when irradiated. That's what these scientists found out. And then there's the blood samples. She turned over her note pages that she had spent the last few hours constructing. All but mine and that of the squib sample absorbed the energy from the spells. Mine and the squibs couldn't handle it. Now we come to the next lot of scientists, Hagrid. The biologists. Inside cells contain not only genetic material, but bodies which carry energy to different parts of the body. In wizards and muggles, the inheritance is Mendelian, which means that the ability to do magic is passed on in the cells, where energy can be absorbed, and transformed into useful power. So you can do magic. In moles, of course, it's totally useless, and our bodies succumb to illnesses and death around magic because we can't handle it. I just don't know why no one has thought of this before." She stopped. But they had. Hadn't Pompops Pomfrey written about something like this when speaking of blood transfusions? She would have to speak to Snobbits to obtain the notes back and read them again. And this is why potions affect moles. Why that Veritaserum made me ill. Why I was close to dying. Hagrid got up from his chair. "Sounds very complicated to me," he said, rubbing Fang on the head. "You'll be better now, lad, won't you? There's more. Every time I look, all the information I have, both mole and wizard. Energy connects it all. It works when I consider energy, in all its different forms." "Yes, and unbelievably simple, now," said Cecilia, filling up with tears again, full of joy. "It's an Einstein moment, that's for sure." Hagrid looked at her. "Oh, as comma then?" he asked. "Another scientist, eh?" Cecilia nodded. "Only the most famous scientist there is, in our world. Albert Einstein. E=mc². The most quoted equation too. Though most people write it down wrong, and don't know what the C stands for. What do it stand for? The speed of light. That's the C. It's actually very easy to understand. Energy can be worked out if we know the mass and if we multiply the speed of light by itself. That's how much energy something had. It was revolutionary at the time. Energy, mass, light. And Lully was the one he figured it out. Now, you can't say that moles and wizards aren't related. No one can. Not even." She stopped, as she realized something else too. "Yes, Mrs. Frobisher. Not even who?" But Cecilia ignored him, racing around his hut collecting up her papers, and looking through them frantically. What if? What if? She said as she looked across page after page. Energy, mass, light. But not mass. Cecilia looked up at Hagrid, and she smiled. "Thank you, Hagrid," she said, crossing the floor and giving him a hug. "You don't know what it's meant to me to come here and work in peace." She took one of his hands and gave it a kiss. "Excuse me, I've got to find Snape. He needs to know about this." And without any further delay, Cecilia raced out of Hagrid's hut, almost slipping in the mud outside. She dropped a page from her book, and scrabbled to pick it up, throwing it inside one of the books she had under her arm, and continued to hurry back along the bridge that connected the scarp slope she had climbed down on Thursday to the castle courtyard, and along the corridor to the Mole Studies classroom. The door was locked, as she had left it hours ago. Cecilia could still see her books inside, and she grabbed the key from her pocket, throwing down her precious research notes onto the flagstones as she scrambled inside. Once she had it, Cecilia raced swiftly down the corridor again and then up through the main doors. This part of the castle seemed much gloomier, and she kicked the tops of the stairs with her toes in her haste to climb them,